Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the show. Today, Prime Minister Justin
Something I'll never know.
unveiled his new cabinet. Several ministers have changed portfolios. There are some new ministers and some who are being shuffled out of their portfolios. There are 3 ministers who are out of cabinet entirely. The former youth minister, Berdish Chagger, has lost her position. There's the former foreign affairs minister, Mark Garneau, has lost his position. The third minister to lose his position is Jim Carr. To look at some of the biggest shuffles, Patty Hajdu has moved from health to Indigenous Services. Johnny Duclos has moved from Treasury Board to Health. Anita Anand has moved from Procurement to Defense. Harjit Sajjan has moved from Defense to International Development. Jonathan Wilkinson has moved from Environment to Natural Resources. Stephen Gilboa has moved from Heritage to Environment. Melanie Joly has moved from Economic Development and Official Languages to Foreign Affairs. Ahmed Hussein has picked up a new portfolio, Minister of Housing, in addition to Diversity and Inclusion. And finally, Carolyn Bennett will move from Crown Indigenous Relations to a new portfolio of Mental Health. Obviously, there's many other shuffles that happened today, but joining me today to discuss all of this new cabinet and what I just mentioned is David Akin, who's the Chief Political Correspondent for Global News, Kate Harrison, the Vice Chair of Summa Strategies, and also a Director at Abacus Data, Kathleen Monk, a Public Affairs Strategist, and the former Communications Advisor for former NDP leader Jack Layton. And also joining me is David Kahn, the former leader of the Alberta Liberal Party. David Akin, I'll start with you. There were 3 ministers who were left out of cabinet entirely today, being the former Special Representative for the Prairies, Jim Carr, who was left out, which was perhaps not surprising due to some of his health issues. But then I think the 2 that left everyone very shocked was Mark Garneau, who was the Foreign Affairs Minister, who got dropped entirely. Many people were suspecting that he would at least even stay on as Foreign Affairs Minister, because obviously his role getting the 2 Michaels home, and then Berdish Chagger got kind of unexpectedly removed from cabinet. So maybe speak a little bit about that and why you think both of those 2 people were left out of cabinet.
Yeah, all 3 sort of interesting, and there were some other notables, I think, left out of cabinet. We'll get to chat with David in a minute from Calgary. There is a Liberal MP in Calgary, and if you got one MP in Calgary, I think that MP ought to go in cabinet, but that's George Chahal, and that's he's got some issues. It's remarkable to me that that's one that, even with what I think will be a very minor infraction that George Chahal may have committed, that you don't put someone from Calgary in federal cabinet. But David, I know you have a chance to chat about that. The big surprise for me was Berdish Chagger not going in cabinet. Berdish came into the parliament, came into the House of Commons in 2015, and she had been an executive assistant to a Kitchener area Liberal MP for a long time. And she, at the time that she was elected in 2015, I can tell you that the Trudeau gang at the center saw her as a real political hustler, real good organizer. And I think that she ended up in cabinet at that time. Remember, she was the first government House leader during the majority. And I think she got that job on the strength of her ability to organize and be a political hustler. So she's out now. I'm not exactly sure why, but I do take note of this, that she's from that part of Ontario called Southwestern Ontario. It's part of the province I grew up in. I'm a Guelph guy. And there's a highway that goes sort of north and south from Hamilton up to Owens, up to Tobermory, Highway 6. And if you take everything west of Highway 6, you get Guelph, London, Kitchener-Waterloo, Cambridge, Windsor. Population, about 3 million people. Lots of Liberals. Liberals almost swept London. There's one New Democrat there. They have Guelph. They swept Kitchener-Waterloo. I'm trying to think, Kitchener-Waterloo, Cambridge. And they won an important hold down in Windsor. And they won some other seats in Southwestern Ontario. 3 million people. 0 cabinet ministers. 0. Berdish was the only representative from Southwestern Ontario, also known as the Rust Bucket. We call it the Rust Belt of Ontario.
The Rust Belt, yeah.
The Rust Belt, exactly. Think of this, though. Atlantic Canada, with 2.5 million people, 2.5 million people in Atlantic Canada, 6 ministers. Surprise of the day with all that's going on in Atlantic Canada. 6 ministers in Atlantic Canada, 2.5 million people, 3 million people, Southwestern Ontario, bupkis. In fact, the minister there got dropped. Not sure why. Mark Garneau is kind of an interesting one. Mark is just turned, he's in his early 70s, I think. I should have looked this up. Yeah, I was a little surprised to see that he didn't want to hang around. And I suppose there was a maybe a discussion between the prime minister, and I would assume there would have been a discussion between the prime minister and Marc Garneau. Remember, they were leadership contestants in the leadership contest that Trudeau won a long time ago. And I think maybe the PM might, and I don't know this, PM may have said, listen, Mark, I'm thinking of somebody else for foreign affairs minister, anything else you want to do? And he might have said no. And then the rumor mill in Ottawa is, you want to be ambassador to Paris? So look for Ambassador Garneau very shortly. I think that will be a nice way out there. And then you're right, Wyatt, Jim Carr, I think Jim Carr had been, quote, special representative for the prairies. And now, oh, look, there's two Liberals in the cabinet for the prairies. So you don't need a special representative because you've got Randy Boissonneau up in Edmonton and Dan Vandel, who is still in Winnipeg. And there's another one, right? Think of that. 2 cabinet seats. There's nobody elected in Saskatchewan for the Liberals, so they can't put anybody in there. But, there's just 2, Manitoba, Alberta, Saskatchewan. What's population there? Lots. And again, 6 cabinet spots for Atlantic Canada. Somebody quipped today too, Wyatt, you may have seen this. The path to cabinet, Justin Trudeau's wedding party or McGill.
Yeah.
Insider stuff there. Sorry, everybody. Yeah. Anyways, sorry, Wyatt, there's a long answer question of those 3. Bardis was the surprise one for me. Not so much Garneau or Jim.
Kate Harrison, Baroness Chager, as we just heard, was removed from cabinet. She served as diversity, inclusion, and youth minister. So maybe outline kind of the same question to you as I asked David, why you think she might have been removed, but outline some of the speculations I heard today on one of the news networks. A bunch of commentators were speculating she might try to become the whip of the government. So what do you think her political future could be?
Yeah, it's a little hard to say. I agree with what David said. A bit surprising to see her removed. Obviously, young woman of color, on a very good trajectory within government. Something that I'm mindful of is she did have to carry a lot of the water and the political scandal around the We Charity incident.
That's right.
That involved her pretty substantially. She didn't wear that the best, and it is still somewhat, recent in people's minds. So it's possible that might have played a role there. I do agree as well with what David said, just in terms of Southwestern Ontario representation. It is absent from this cabinet when you consider that nearly a third of cabinet is all from the GTA. Why a couple of those seats couldn't have gone to Southwestern Ontario, where there is a huge population density, is a bit of a head scratcher. But for as many kind of sad stories as there are around Bardis Chager, there's also a lot of really great stories that come out today for rules for women in this government. There will not be a defense procurement, for example, that does not require the oversight and attention of 80% women. Melanie Joly at Foreign Affairs, Anita Anand obviously at Defense, Tassie at Procurement, and Mona Fortier at Treasury Board. Those are major roles. So when we're talking about things like gender parity and an equal cabinet, oftentimes that's kind of lip service, and the roles that women are given don't have that kind of substance and that backing. That is not the true. That isn't true in the case of this government. So the Prime Minister deserves some kudos for that.
David Kahn, we've heard some of the big surprises about the 3 ministers who were removed from cabinet. But maybe speaking about some of the other surprises that you saw, maybe some ministers that you didn't expect to be shuffled who were shuffled.
Yeah, well, with respect to Marc Garneau, I'm not coming up with anything scintillating or mind-blowing here, but I was surprised. People have speculated that if he was not going to be in cabinet, directly after an election, and with his age and with his experience in foreign affairs, if he was going to be appointed to as ambassador to France, should this not have been a conversation that they had before the election, and he could have not run, and they could have run another candidate, perhaps a star candidate in that riding, and he could go on to be appointed ambassador to France. Now they've got if this does indeed happen, they have to have a by-election, and that's kind of a bit wasteful, especially in a space of a month or it's by-elections just be called for a number of months, but it still seems weird that he ran, and then with all this speculation now that he'll be appointed to another role outside of Parliament. So a bit surprised there. I guess I could speak to George Chahal's being left out of cabinet. He was a wonderful city councillor here in Calgary, very well respected, only one term, but very well respected. And he, I can tell you from personal experience, it's not easy to run under the Liberal banner in Calgary and in Alberta. He took that challenge on, declined to run for another term in city council because the election was happening basically at the same time. And he won it was a big win in Calgary. There's been very few federal Liberals ever elected in Calgary. So yeah, I mean, I feel very badly for him. It was, I think it could be very easily characterized as a minor transgression, what he did, removing a flyer from a constituent's mailbox. Still unclear whether it was because he claimed that the information was wrong on that flyer or not. But I mean, it's really too bad that he's missed this opportunity. But I think in the fullness of time, we'll put it in perspective, and hopefully we'll see him in cabinet, because I know him personally, and he's a very smart, compassionate man. So, but yeah, Stephen Guilbeault for environment, that's a big one for me. I mean, putting an environmental activist who once worked for Greenpeace in the environmental portfolio is, I think it really signals to the rest of the world and to Canada that we're really serious about climate change and the environment. And I hope that he really brings his passion for those issues to the world stage at COP26 in Glasgow. So looking forward to seeing what he can do there. I feel a bit badly for Jonathan Wilkinson, who I know really loved that portfolio, but he's been moved to natural resources. And these days, those two portfolios, environment and natural resources, are very, very intimately linked. And I think we'll be seeing a lot more of Jonathan Wilkinson here in Alberta and in Calgary. So I look forward to the role he's going to play there. So yeah, those are a few of my initial thoughts.
Hey, Wyatt, just quickly about George Chahal. Sorry, Kathleen, just going to put in with this. So I traveled with all the leaders during the campaign, and Trudeau's only stop was in Calgary. Calgary Skyview is George Chahal's riding, and he campaigned with George, and it was pretty darn clear at the time, George wins, he's coming to cabinet. And Wyatt, you and I ran into each other on the campaign in Cambridge. You'll remember that. I think you asked the PM a question, or the Liberal leader a question, and that was an event where the PPC mobs are out there yelling and screaming, and it was a disaster. Weirdly, the quietest and most mob-free event was the PM's visit in Calgary Skyview. It went off without a hitch. There was no protesters. It was a pleasant afternoon. So odd. I just find that Calgary and that George Chahal visit was about the quietest day on the Trudeau Liberal tour, which otherwise was beset by usually noisy mobs protesting. Anyways, just a little anecdote from the trail there.
And Kathleen, I mean, in terms of, there were lots of, obviously, I think the Prime Minister and other ministers, Chrystia Freeland, gave numerous interviews today. They noted about it's hard to build a cabinet, and there were obviously lots of people who weren't able to make it around the cabinet table who were perhaps qualified to do so. But when just looking at it, were there any ministers who, even let's say last night, you thought for sure this person was going to get into cabinet, and then as we headed into today, they didn't get a cabinet position?
That's a really good question. I mean, there are certainly a lot of new MPs that were elected that David mentioned earlier from that Rust Belt area that I had money on, so to speak, in the London area, certainly that I thought would get in that region. They didn't, that's fine. But ultimately, I still thought actually one of the takeaways that we haven't talked a lot about so far is it was a really significant shakeup in the sense that there were really only around 7, maybe a bit more ministers that got to keep their portfolio that they had previously. So that's a lot of churn, if you will. Even if some of the people stayed in cabinet, there was still a lot of churn in terms of what positions they currently hold. I think, one of the stories that needs to be unpacked in the days to come, though, however, is the new ministries. And this is always the exciting part when we're looking at it. And I haven't had a chance to look at, I'm sure my colleagues have, but the cabinet committees, or have the mandate letters been put out quite yet? I don't think, not at this current moment, but like looking at how they will run those committees and who will be sitting where, that's something that I'm watching for. But another thing that I'm watching for is really to see how Ahmed Hussein, the new Minister of Housing, and how Carolyn Bennett, the new Minister of Addictions and Mental Health, how they'll be operating in those ministries, mainly because we've just seen Minister Hussein, who was formerly the Minister of Families, kind of churn out like 8 deals with the provinces and territories. And now his job basically is like, do it again, but this time on housing, right? So that's his gig. And same thing, Minister Bennett, although many have been characterizing her kind of like a demotion or a push out of cabinet for her exchanges that she had with JWR prior to the campaign, but really she's got a lot of work to do. You know, the opioid crisis is a massive one that has affected so many families across Canada and taken thousands of lives. And she has a lot of money also to distribute and to negotiate with the provinces. So I think those are the things that I'm watching for.
Okay, David, and I'll go to you again. You've already mentioned quite a bit about this, but you posted today on Twitter about some of the regions in the country who have lost representation, including the National Capital Region, which is now down to 1 minister, that being Mona Fortier, who was chosen as president of the Treasury Board. She obviously moved from Associate Minister of Finance and the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity, who I would also point out there's no such thing as a middle class prosperity minister anymore. And then there's zero ministers. There's 0 ministers in southwestern Ontario. So that was what you tweeted today. So how big of a factor do you think Justin Trudeau considered regional representation to be in this cabinet, given that, we were expecting more ministers from Ottawa, we were expecting more ministers from southwestern Ontario, we were even, I think a lot of people were expecting Yasser Naqvi, obviously many people were suspecting Bardish Chagger to remain in cabinet, some people were mentioning Jenna Sudds or Leah Taylor-Roy, so how big of an impact do you think regional representation had?
Yeah, so I wrote about this like 2 days after the election. The obligatory pundit's prediction about who would go into cabinet, and that column, by the way, I think was Chahal, Cuyahoga, Diab, sure bets for cabinet. And you mentioned, I think Kathleen, Southwestern Ontario, Ariel Cuyahoga is Black from Burundi, bilingual, city councillor, and she's from Southwestern Ontario.
Yeah.
And not only is she talented, but of course she's young. She represents a lot of the future for the Liberal Party. And there was a lot of criticism of the Prime Minister in probably 2015 for not going to Black members of his caucus. He did this time. Marcy Ian is a new cabinet face, Toronto Centre. But I thought Ariel Cuyahoga, I thought, how do you not, like, that's cheap. Boy, she looks terrific. There's one when I wrote about that. There's your regional consideration and some other considerations as well on gender and diversity. Shahal, we just talked about that. And then I went Lena Metlach-Diab, who is a Halifax West representing, replacing Jeff Regan there. And at Nova Scotia, normally, most PMs, you get 1 minister from Nova Scotia. That's it. And so I thought, Sean Fraser, who is the minister for Nova Scotia, our new immigration minister, talented guy, everybody says. That guy is super talented. Well, I tell you, there's a whole lot of talented fellas in the Liberal caucus, but the problem is we're doing gender diversity, or gender parity rather. And so I thought, wow, with Lena Metlach-Diab, she's a former justice minister in the Nova Scotia government. Lebanese, the whole immigrant story. Boy, she's terrific. I've covered Nova Scotia elections where I thought she'd be in. So there's your regional comportment. Long story short is any prime minister, Wyatt, it starts with the first rule is, if I got 1 MP from each province, that MP's going into cabinet. It happened with Stephen Harper. He only ever elected 1 MP from Prince Edward Island. That was Gail Shea. I'm not so sure Gail, had she been elected from the GTA, that she would have gone into cabinet, quite frankly. She's a very nice woman and all, but she was the only Conservative from Prince Edward Island. She's going into cabinet. So you're going to do 1 for sure from each province. So when the pundits were all speculating, that's where you start. 1 from each province. Okay, well, we already got Seamus in Newfoundland and Labrador, no reason to move him, and he didn't move. The weird thing is we went to Western Newfoundland. Goody Hutchins is in. Goody's great. She's a former PS. And I think my Liberal source is saying the fact that Scott Sims lost in rural Newfoundland scared the heck out of the Liberal Brain Trust. Who knows, we're probably going to the polls again in two years. So they want to shore up that. I think that's why we see 6 Atlantic Atlantic folks. Same thing in New Brunswick. Liberals suffered some losses in New Brunswick. Boom, let's get Jeanette Petitbot-Taylor back into cabinet. I don't know why she was dropped in the first place. She went from health minister to deputy whip. Seems an odd one. Anyway, she's back there. So there's your regional component, one from each thing. And then we have in Ontario, I'm told if you take a look at Trudeau and the GTA, you've got the GTA's got 4 regions: Durham, Halton, Peel, and York. So you want to try and have 2 from each. Can't do that in Durham. That's Aaron O'Toole's riding. But definitely in York region is where Deb Schulte lost. That was the Minister of Seniors. And that's where Helena Jazik has just arrived in cabinet. Helena's husband just died, not even a week ago. He was in palliative care sort of prior to that, just as the election ended. Helena's a really interesting character, if you ask me. She's a former Ontario Minister of Health. That's a huge portfolio, Ontario Minister of Health. So she's also got an MBA. She's also a doctor herself. How she missed being in cabinet the first time around beats me. But anyways, there's Helena now. She's in cabinet as the FedDev minister. I don't think her talents are being used. She's going to be handing out checks to businesses in Southern Ontario. So that's her job. Anyways, 2 from York, 2 from Peel, 2 from Halton. As I mentioned, nothing from Southwestern Ontario. You got usually Manitoba. You can get 1 or 2 from Manitoba. You usually want to have 1 in Saskatchewan. You don't because there's no MPs. If you got Calgary and Edmonton, as Trudeau did in 2015, he had Ken Hare and he had Amarjeet Sohi at Calgary and Edmonton. Not sure what's going on there. BC is still a problem, I think, for the Liberals, even though they they finished 3rd in the popular vote in BC. 3rd, and they won the most seats. Thank you, first past the post system, which I know Kathleen and other New Democrats are hard to change. But BC is a problem. It's still lower mainland. There's 3? Qualtrough, Sagan, Joyce Murray. Am I missing anybody from BC?
Wilkinson.
Oh, Wilkinson, of course. Absolutely. So 4 from BC. So that's really the regional breakdown. You want to try and do, I think the Liberal strength is in urban Canada. So that's where it's going to be. The Liberals they lost seats in rural Canada. And a lot of Liberals I'm talking to say, we got to connect with rural Canada somehow, some way. That was Scott Sims. That was losing Miramichi. And that is going to be a task, I think, political task for the new cabinet.
And Kate, obviously COP26 is beginning on October 31st. So obviously, I think many people were expecting, first of all, Jonathan Wilkinson to stay in environment. That way it's only 5 days in between. You can just get on a plane and head to Scotland. So do you think that Stephen Guilbeault was a good choice for environment minister, especially with COP26 ahead?
It's not a choice without some risk, and I'm sure David Kahn can speak to that from a Westerner perspective and an Alberta perspective. Conservatives have a lot to say about this appointment, and I think probably will in the days and the weeks to come. But I'm actually a little more interested to see how other environmental organizations react to this appointment. It's one thing to kind of say that all of these groups are the same. Stephen Guilbeault represents the very radical side of the environmental movement in Canada. There are a lot of other environmental organizations that might not really have that same persuasion. Will Stephen Guilbeault only really be the voice of équiterre around the table, or is he going to actually listen to other more moderate groups when it comes to, for example, nature-based conservation? I think it will be a challenge for Guilbeault to find that balance and to project that balance. It's something that he did struggle with at Heritage, and he had his wrist slapped for it. So the optics are there and obvious, and I think he campaigned pretty hard for the job. And trying to do some favors in Quebec was also a factor there, I assume, when they were going about making this cabinet. But it is a risky appointment, and I think that there will be a lot of folks that are looking to try and find the cracks in the armor for Stephen Guilbeault and try and show that this was maybe done out of optics and haste as opposed to ability.
David, you can comment on a bit of what Kate said if you want, but then also your province now has representation around the cabinet table, as we mentioned, with Randy Boissonnault being the new tourism minister and the associate finance minister. But out of any portfolio he could have received, do you think that portfolio will be what can bring representation from Albertans from the cabinet table? I mean, many people could have said he could have been in, let's say, natural resources, because obviously oil and gas in Alberta is huge. So just what do you think about in terms of the positioning that Randy Wassenaar was put in today?
Well, I think Mr. Wasno is a very talented man. I believe he was a Rhodes Scholar, very smart guy, very capable. He was parliamentary secretary in the past before his election loss in 2019. So he's got some sort of sub-cabinet experience. I think he could have taken on any role. Perhaps they want to ease him, into cabinet, being his first cabinet post, and so not to throw him into the deep end. But I think he's highly capable, and he could perform well, I think, in any portfolio. I'm not sure what Associate Minister of Finance does on a day-to-day basis, but
neither are we, David.
Hopefully he can dig his chops into that finance role. I mean, that's the biggest, really the biggest portfolio there is. So hopefully you can really support Christopher Freeland in that role, and tourism is nothing to to sniff at. It's an important growing economic generator for Canada. Hopefully it will continue to grow post COVID, and so I think he'll do well wherever he's placed, and I think he can really grow into a larger portfolio. I think with Stephen Guilbeault, we've all, or many of us anyway, have been more radical in our youth. So I think with age, it comes maturity, and I really expect that he'll be able to stand around the edges and to really reach out across the aisle and really try to build some bridges and distance himself from his more radical past. But I think it also really speaks to his passion and commitment to the environment and climate change, and I think that will really stand him in good stead. So I look forward to what he can do in Glasgow and beyond.
And
why? Can I just jump in on one thing? Because I'm curious to hear. And by the way, your questions are excellent. And I got to keep remembering, right? What's wrong? And these questions are great.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about Kathleen and Kate's take on this, because my sense was the duo of Seamus O'Regan at NRCan and Wilkinson at Environment was a duo that was getting a lot of respect from stakeholders, mostly in industry. They liked Wilkinson. Seamus was doing a great job there. It's a fair demotion, if you ask me, unless we're doing something with labor. I don't know what. I don't know why Seamus got moved to NRCan. I heard nothing but good things about the way he was working with industry in Alberta. And Wilkinson was, yes, green, but pragmatic. And I don't know why they broke up that duo, because that's important, those two ministers, to get industry to invest the billions they need to invest in order to make these green changes. I don't know if the Guilbeault-Wilkinson thing will necessarily be so successful, but I don't know. Maybe, as I say, sorry, Wyatt, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm curious to hear what.
Just to pull on that thread, and obviously Kate probably has to build on it. I would just say that Wilkinson came actually from an energy background. He was involved in solar, if I recall correctly, or green energy of some sort prior to getting into political office. And I think that, I can see his movement to NRCan as being the government trying to obviously build that transition into the green energy economy. And I think he makes a good fit. I think you raise a good question, David Akin, in the sense of why did Seamus have to move? Because he certainly, I think, was well respected by stakeholders. Obviously, he was rooted. The region that he comes from is highly rooted in the resource sector, and obviously was invested there in that. So it does raise some questions. Maybe he wanted. Maybe some people often raise their hand for a step back too. That's possible. But ultimately, I would welcome this government doing progressive movement on labor issues. I have a number of issues I'd love to put at the forefront for sure. I can think of lots of policies if we want to keep my good friend Seamus O'Regan busy. And I'll just correct one thing that David Akin said earlier. I think he said the way into cabinet was either through McGill, through Trudeau's wedding party, or through Canada AM. also
Yes,
with,
yes.
with Marcy, Ian, and Seamus. That's who I worked for in my younger days. So
I was the
so-
substitute host for Seamus. Like when Seamus went on holiday, they phoned me up and said, "You're going to be the candidate almost because Seamus is on holiday." So Bizarro. Yeah, sorry. That's why you're too young to remember that. But there you go.
Just really quickly on Guilbeault. I mean, the guy has some faults as a politician, but being a good communicator is not one of them. And so if the government is looking to really sell a ambitious climate agenda in the province of Quebec, which, by the way, the Conservative provincial government there is also looking at effectively divesting energy assets in the province, which maybe a lot of big C Conservatives would raise some questions about. I wonder if maybe there's an attempt to have a little bit of a parallel there and really kind of go deep on environment and energy issues in Quebec specifically, and that's why you're seeing him kind of rise to the top and Seamus's collateral damage as a result of that.
That is
Yeah, I think
really
it was a bit of
smart
horse trading,
analysis.
right? Like I think Mr. Wilkinson is disappointed about leaving environment, and there was a natural fit with him in natural resources. So, you know, he gets moved over there, and then Mr. O'Regan has to get moved somewhere else.
Don't forget, like I talked to some folks in that orbit, and a lot of the heavy lifting in environment's kind of done. Yes, I know Guilbeault will be there when environmental assessments come in, but the Net Zero Act, Bill C-69, like a lot of the heavy lifting for this government's been done, and now it's implementation time. And you know, Environment Canada, the ministry gets no money to do stuff. You're just like the you know the nanny of cabinet. You got to do better. You got to do this. You know, NRCan's a huge portfolio, and Wilkinson's now going to have some money to spend on sustainable energy grants, all sorts of stuff that he can get stuff done that fulfills the vision of the acts that the government has done. So,
All right. Well, we're going almost near 9:40. So, David, Kate, Kathleen, and the other David, thank you for joining me, and it's been great chatting with you all.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Thanks for having me on, Wyatt.
Real
Thank you.
pleasure.
Bye now.
Yeah, really. Thank you very much for